Welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. Today, I'm speaking with sports scientist and researcher at the Geelong Cats and Deakin University, Jacquie Tran. This episode of the Pacey Performance Podcast is sponsored by Valid Performance, makers of the NordBoard. So if you haven't heard of the NordBoard already, don't worry, I'll explain, it's pretty simple. So the NordBoard is a fast and accurate way to measure hamstring strength. So as you know, practitioners can do very little about athlete age and previous hamstring injury. But what they can do something about is the athlete's strength. So that's where the NordBoard comes into play, giving you real-time hamstring strength readings to enhance training, monitoring and rehabilitation. It isn't going to make your athlete's hamstrings bulletproof, but what it is going to do is give you the right information so you, the practitioner, can make the right decision at the right time. The NordBoard is now available, so if you're interested in finding out a little bit more, you can email info@validperformance.com or visiting validperformance.com. The NordBoard is already in use by almost half the Premier League and dozens of other elite teams worldwide. So the NordBoard hamstring testing system is the new standard for high-performance sport. This episode of the Pacey Performance Podcast is sponsored by Train with Push, creators of the Push Band. So the Push Band is the first scientifically validated wearable device to provide objective insights into your performance in the gym. So using accelerometers and a gyroscope, the Push Band is able to use bar speed to regulate load and volume based on your ability in the gym on any given day. So you can use the Push Band to quickly establish 1 RMs with submaximal load so you can plan with confidence. So the Push Band portal also allows you to create programs before entering the gym to make change on the fly depending on how you are performing on that given day. So you can customize everything from target velocity ranges to differentiating velocities for warm-up and creating working sets and supersets for yourself or your athletes. So if you do want to know more about Train with Push and the Push Band, get yourself over to trainwithpush.com. They also have got a great blog, so you can catch up with some guest bloggers such as Mladen Ivanovic and Dan Baker. So be sure to check them out at trainwithpush.com. Thanks for tuning in to episode 74 of the Pacey Performance Podcast. So today, really excited to get Jacquie Tran on. It's someone I've been stalking, as I mentioned in the episode, for quite some time. So it was great to get her on early in the morning for me, late in the evening for her. So I just want to thank Jacquie for giving up her time. So if you don't know who Jacquie is or want to find more out about her, just go to her website, jacquietran.com. So that's JACQUIETRAN.com. And you'll find a lot more about her, whether it's her research or just her interests, and most importantly, her sketching, which is absolutely incredible. So keep this intro nice and short. Hope you enjoy the chat with Jacquie. I'm sure you will. And just make sure you check out all the other resources that I mentioned in the episode. So like I mentioned, Jacquie's website, make sure you check that out. So enjoy, and I'll speak to you soon. Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to the Pacey Performance Podcast. So today we've got Jacquie Tran on the phone. So just before I get Jacquie in to give us a little bit of introduction, just want to thank her for her time and welcome to the podcast. So welcome to the podcast, Jacquie.
Thanks, Rob. Pleasure.
So like I mentioned, do you want to just give people a little bit of an introduction to who you are and your background and what you're currently doing?
Yeah, sure. So I am definitely a generalist as far as sports scientists go. I've bounced around a few different disciplines, but over the last few years I've been focusing my research on applied physiology, and it has focused on rowing training and performance. But my current role is, while it's still in research, it's in a completely different context again. I'm a research fellow at Deakin University and also working in conjunction with the Geelong Cats Football Club, which is an elite Australian football team. So my role is very varied, very multidisciplinary, and I get to draw on all the different bits of knowledge I've accumulated over the time and networks that I've developed over the time in physiology, biomechanics, elite sport, and in analytics and applied statistics as well. So there's a whole range of things that I do, but mostly it is about elite sports performance and applying scientific techniques to that. So pretty broad, but to me it all makes sense in my head. So hopefully it makes sense to someone else too.
So the rowing stuff, is that something that's a passion of yours, or is that just something that's kind of fallen your way?
Yeah, I mean, at the time, it was just a great opportunity that came across my desk. So I did my honours with Paul Gaston back in 2009. A little while ago, and that was a biomechanics focused honours project. Then I took a year off after that, but Paul contacted me in contact and told me about a jointly supported PhD opportunity with Rowing Australia, the Australian Institute of Sport, and Deakin, and I decided to apply for that role because of the opportunity it would give me to work with some of the best of the best. And my external supervisor was Tony Rice, who is the National Sports Science Coordinator for Rowing Australia. So I hadn't had any connection at that point to the Australian Institute of Sport, and I wanted to continue working with Paul as well. So it just seemed a really good fit. At the time, I didn't know anything about rowing, actually, so I just threw myself in the deep end, quite literally, and it was a great learning experience. And I really developed a passion for rowing, but it didn't start off that way. So it was a great challenge for me to come into a sport where I didn't have any prior experience, and then have to learn as I go. But I think it gave me an advantage in some ways, because I was fresh eyes, and I was a bit of an outside observer to begin with. So I asked a lot of naive questions, but I think that was a good way to start a research project, is without any preconceived ideas about the sport. So yeah, my 4 years studying as a PhD student was really heavily focused on rowing, but have gone in a slightly different direction now, just as job opportunities have gone, but still very, very interested in rowing and pursuing that. So hopefully I can continue to apply my trade in rowing at some point down the line.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So, I mean, it's quite a daunting thing for people, getting approached to work in a different sport they've never been involved in the past. Do you just want to talk to us about the kind of process that you went through to actually first not just learn about the sport and maybe, watch guys training and competing, but really get into the nitty-gritty of the sport to actually fully understand it? Do you just want to talk to us about that process that you went through? Yeah,
sure. Look, I think that one of the things that is a very simple thing to do for me, it was to go out and try the sport and to get a physical sensation of what the sport is like, because I had never rowed before. So that for me was a new experience, just to even get a feeling, just as a lay person, I suppose, or a newcomer to the sport. I guess I also took on board the advice of a few people around me, and from conference presentations that I heard, keynote presentations. And one of the key things I remember Tim Gabbett mentioning at one of his many presentations was that the best things that he'd learned about sports science had come from standing next to a coach during a training session, observing them, asking questions, being unafraid to ask those naive questions. Why did you choose to do it that way? Or why have you structured in such a way? And so I really took that to heart and really pushed for opportunities to do that. So and my supervisors were very supportive of that as well, which was critical to it being effective. And so Tony got me out on the water with some of the national coaches, and I was able to sit and observe training, ask them questions, and I learnt a lot that way. And I tried my hand at rowing. It wasn't very effective. I ended up on the wrong side of the river and had to be somewhat rescued by the club captain. But I tried it, and I got a feel for it and understood how technically it is. And so I guess I can say I have that first-hand experience. But I guess ultimately one of Paul's pieces of advice to me when I was early on in my studies has really stuck with me, which is that if you're a good scientist, it really doesn't matter what sport you go to, because it all ultimately begins with understanding the needs and the demands of that particular sport. But the science ultimately the scientific methods and the scientific approach should be applicable across sports if you do that needs analysis up front. So I really wasn't daunted in a funny way. I was really excited by the challenge to throw myself into a completely new environment.
Cool. So one thing I found, so basically, just to take that back a bit, not with guests, I'll do a little bit of stalking online, which is always fun, going through people's Twitter accounts and personal websites and things.
Sure.
So one thing I came across with yourself was interest in kind of analytics and predictive modeling. So that's kind of a very, very broad term. Do you just want to give us a little bit of information on, firstly, the kind of predictive modeling that you were interested in, and what you were trying to predict with the work that you were doing and the thing that you're interested in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, to be honest, the predictive modeling that I had developed an interest in early on in my PhD, we never got there with my PhD, and it's still something that that I'm working towards. And I think largely because as I delved myself into this area was discovering that as much as many sports want to use this kind of approach to draw deeper insights and be able to potentially forecast events from their data. Many different settings, organizations need to get the basics of their data management right and data collection right. And so I've been spending, I would say, a lot of the last few years really working with all sorts of different individuals across different sports and organizations to improve that most fundamental level of data management. Before progressing to something more ambitious. But for me personally, I am interested in using large data sets over multiple years to look at team performance, and particularly moving now more into interactive patterns of behavior within teams and then between teams in invasion sports. So that's where my analytics research is heading, and I've got a couple of honours students working on parts of projects in that kind of area. So I'm interested in dynamic systems that will change second to second almost, or minute to minute throughout a game, depending on the status of who's winning and losing at different times. So I'm kind of interested in those sorts of questions as far as predictive modeling goes, and trying to identify patterns of team play that link more closely with success or may match well against a different type of pattern, so that we might actually use this kind of analytical technique not just to, for example, there's some great examples of analytics in talent development and talent identification. There's ongoing work in injury prevention and risk management. I'm interested in using analytics from a tactical standpoint. So how can we use this information to make strategic decisions and help give more objective information to coaches when they're making their decisions about how to structure their team play?
Mm-hmm. Cool. So you mentioned there about the kind of basics of data collection. For me, there's a big disconnect between kind of using statistical methods in like a master's or an undergrad to get through an assignment, but actually using that on them techniques in the field. Do you just want to talk to us a little bit about what you mean by the basics of data collection and how you're advising people in using them big data sets?
Yeah, sure. Look, I mean, I think even it begins with small data, let alone big data.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, sometimes big data it can be easier to deal with because big data is typically collected using sensors or teams of data analysts who are bringing data together. So there is a sort of inherent structure to it already. But there is a lot of small data that we use in sport that isn't necessarily structured very well, or even collected in a systematic and a consistent, reliable way. So some of the advice that I guess I share with the people that work with me are around having a real clarity around the processes of collecting the data. So having standard operating procedures for data collection, having standard operating procedures for data cleaning to make sure that the same process is followed, even if someone happens to be on leave or someone happens to move organisations or change sports or change careers. We have a lot of issues with data being kept in a consistent manner, not because there isn't the database to store it or servers that are big enough. That's typically not the problem that I've encountered in the sports that I've worked with. The problem is usually because there is a large throughput of staff. Sometimes quite a rapid turnover of staff. Processes change and they're not documented. And so when one person leaves, their processes go with them. And it's not always very clear how they got from A to B to C. So sometimes it's just the real basics of writing everything down, having an instructional manual and following the same procedures every time you go through a reproduced process. So yeah, it's a lot of teaching that kind of basic stuff. When I say basic, I really do mean basic. And also understanding things like data types, understanding the difference between continuous and discrete data, or ordinal and interval data and ratio data, and these are things that can seem really dry to sports science and exercise science students. A lot of times they come into this kind of degree, not to become math whizzes, and that's not my intention either to make them into math whizzes, but some appreciation for the mathematical logic is really important to work with data well and to use it well for the purposes of actually changing behavior and changing performance.
Mm-hmm. How much of an influence is this kind of I don't know what to call it, kind of fashion almost about data? How do you think it's kind of affecting not just the kind of traditional, what you might class as a sports scientist, but the kind of even the coach? How much upskilling are the coaches needing in kind of 2016 in this what I call fashion of collecting lots of data? Are you finding that there's the gap is kind of growing, or do you think that we're doing as scientists doing a good job of kind of keeping everyone in that sync, if that makes any sort of sense?
Yeah, no, it does. I think there's always upskilling to be done. I think it kind of feels like maybe my observations from 5, 6, 7 years ago, when I started to notice that there were more senior or elite level coaches who actually had gone and pursued sports science studies themselves, so that they could feel informed enough to have those discussions with the sports scientists that they worked with, rather than just taking them on their word. They actually could be informed enough to have real debates and discussions about different sports science approaches. And I think that's where we're at now with using data to inform coaching practice, is that there are coaches out there who have a good understanding of math and others who do need to upskill. But it's not just math, I suppose. It's also, I guess, a data literacy. And I think there is some way to go, but certainly some of the coaches I've worked with have been great and picked it up really quickly. Some have already come, I guess, ready-made with those skill sets, maybe from other careers that they've had throughout their lives. And some, want to use this kind of technique but don't know where to start, and they don't have a math background or a science background or a data background, and they know that they've got some work to do to understand this. But I see it as being a matter of time, and I think it's overall the fashion or the trend of utilizing statistics and utilizing data more intelligently in sport. I think ultimately it's a positive thing, because it means that more people are asking questions of the available information, rather than, okay, you're the analyst or you're the sports scientist, you tell me what you think. This way we can have more eyes on it, asking more questions. And I think that ultimately means we hopefully get to better answers.
Mm-hmm. So that's obviously a very daunting thing for a coach to be kind of educated in that way, because I'm guessing that when these coaches, decided to be a coach at 30, 35, 40, whatever it was, they probably didn't realize that somebody would be telling them about statistics and maths and things like that. But what is the process that you go through to kind of introduce them and maybe educate them? Because obviously it's not an easy thing to be doing.
Yeah, I think it comes back to something that gets hammered into you when you're a research, and at the time you think it's pretty cliche, but it really does apply in terms of teaching or engaging people in content which might be a bit daunting to begin with. So, in research, we get told all the time, what's the question? What's the question? What's the question? What's the question that you're asking? And so if you focus it around the problem that's trying to be, that a coach is trying to solve, then their engagement comes along with that. But if you come at it from a perspective of, okay, we're going to sit down for an hour and we're going to talk about data, well, you'll see their eyes glaze over in a millisecond. Yeah. But if it's, hey, I know that you're having, you're having some concerns about how, this particular structure may or may not be working. Let's look at some information that might help us answer that question, whether or not it's working. And then if it's a problem that they're solving, then I guess it may still be daunting, but they can push through it because they're looking for a solution to their coaching problem, not their math problem.
Yeah, I understand. Cool. So just another one that came up in the stalking session, which didn't take much stalking, to be honest, was your interest in understanding training load, and we've discussed it a little bit with regards to your kind of your rowing stuff, but I just want to talk to us a little bit about, firstly, why that interest exists and how we as scientists, coaches, whatever it may be, go about introducing a method of analysing training load and maybe the different caveats that exist in that question.
Yep, sure. Yeah, I guess to answer the first part of the question, where my interest comes from, I guess where it really stems from is the fact that that's the major stimulus that we have. That's the major way that we affect change in athletes and try to stimulate adaptations and try to ultimately improve performance. So to me, it seems like a logical first point for a young sports scientist to focus on is the big rock of how we manage training, how we prescribe it, how we adjust it, and how we can get a picture of whether what they've done matches what we thought that they would do. And I think that's in some sports can be relatively straightforward. I will say with that bit of a disclaimer there, or a bit of an out clause. I think that in the team sport setting or in the football setting where I am now, it's incredibly difficult because you have such a range of demands on the body. So you have locomotor demands, then you have central cardiovascular demands, you have neurological demands, neurophysiological demands, you have perceptual and psychological demands, and they all have their different ways of being captured, but to integrate that into one understanding of how demanding was training today or this week is a really, really difficult thing. Whereas in other sports, it's slightly easier. For example, in a more standardized environment like swimming, you don't capture everything by capturing distance and speed and internal measures that you might capture, lactates, heart rate, whatnot. You don't get it's not quite as it's not straightforward. It's not completely simple, but it is simpler than something like football, where you've got a lot of different factors that can affect training and not be represented well in the training load units sometimes, or training load measures that you might select. So I think that's I guess that the challenge of that is attractive to me, and that it is such a fundamental part of athlete management. So those two things have really fueled my interest in the area. And I guess, in terms of recommendations, I guess I'm no closer to it than anyone else in terms of advising what the best way to monitor load would be. But again, I guess it starts from really identifying what are the demands of the sport and being as open-minded about that as possible. Not thinking about, let's just capture the physiological load, or let's just capture how far they've run. That might be a starting point, but I think the best load monitoring systems that I've seen have been multifaceted, have incorporated multiple measures and have really brought the athletes and the coaches along with the purpose of doing that and the value of doing that. I've seen load monitoring systems implemented where there are 5, 6, 7 measures taken of training, but that hasn't necessarily been communicated well to athletes and coaches. And then it just seems like an exercise in recording information. And so I think there's two components to an effective load monitoring system, and it's having multifaceted measures that capture unique information from each other, and also having the athletes and coaches engaged in that so they can actually provide information as necessary, but also query it and provide additional information, contextual information that might help to decide, okay, today was a hard session and the number looks a little bit different, but the athletes and the coaches have important information to tell us as well about whether or not that was a demanding session or not. So trying to integrate that objective, subjective, external, internal, it's very complex, but at the same time, I think that's really the way that we have to go if we want to monitor load well. But it probably starts from a simple base, and then you build from there step by step.
Do you think there's a little bit of a missing link there that people forget about, that input from coaches, from technical coaches? Or is that something that you think is done well with regards to letting them have feedback on this in this process?
I guess maybe it depends on the sport.
Okay.
I haven't worked personally in cricket, for example, but from colleagues and friends who have worked in cricket, the technical coaching side of it feeds into the load monitoring, because it's about number of balls faced, the number of balls bowled, and okay, today we were doing lots of speed work in terms of the bowling, or today we were doing more placement and accuracy, and we're backing off on the speed. So the coaches feed into that process of understanding load. But I think in other sports, there's a huge opportunity there to better understand the demands placed on athletes by involving the coaches in that process, and not making it this is just the fitness department's job to monitor load. Actually, it's everyone's job. It's the athletes, it's the coaches, it's the sports scientists and the fitness staff and the medical staff, and it's everyone's responsibility. So I think that there are opportunities to improve in that respect for sure.
Mm-hmm. So for someone coming into a new role or their first role, which I think is probably important for the guys that have been around for a number of years as well. But what would be the kind of first port of call with regards to setting up a system to understand training load? What's the first thing that you would suggest is sit down and do what?
The first thing that I would do is see what's been done before.
Okay.
And I think if it's your first effort at establishing a system, even if you have your own ideas about what the perfect system might be in a particular sport, so much of it is about shaping behavior and having people engaged in the process. So I think it's important to firstly assess what has been done, what has worked, and also what hasn't worked and why, because that may be revealing about the ways that you might choose to deliver future changes. I can think of some great examples from water polo and from the Australian water polo program, particularly the women's program, where I remember hearing a talk from Andrea Mosler, who is now at Aspire Academy, but spent a long time with the women's water polo team at the AIS. And, I think we're going back now, probably it's 10, maybe 15 years, where they started off with really simplistic load monitoring. It was, how many hours of training did you do today? And don't tell me anything else. I just want that basic information, because what had come before that was very little. And then from there, Andrea built on that, and they saw the value of recording, okay, player X has done 15 hours this week and player Y has done 20. So, player Y has done 25% more than player X. And what implications does that have for recovery, for injury risk, and so forth? And then in that process of having a very simple load monitoring system, then the coaches and the athletes started to ask questions and go, oh, well, yeah, she did 20, but it was 20 easy hours and I did 15 hard hours. So how do you represent that? And then you start to get those questions, and then you can build and say, okay, well, yeah, training hours only captures an aspect of volume. Now we need an intensity measure. So how about let's measure some intensity? These are some methods that we can do that. So I think it's about chaining it and starting from where you're at rather than trying to implement, the ideal system from day dot. I think every system can improve a little bit, but it's about having incremental change and bringing your athletes and your coaches along that journey with you.
Very interesting. So I just want to bring the one of the points I had towards the end forward, just because firstly it's interesting to me,
Sure.
which is the sketching side of things. So if anyone hasn't seen your sketches, they're unbelievable. But do you want to just talk to us about, firstly, why you do them, and what does it give to you, and what do you feel it gives to people that are reading them?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I have to say that I still continue to be surprised at the impact and the reach of my sketch notes, because when I started doing them, they really weren't for anyone else. They were for me and to enhance my own understanding. I realized that, as I started to attend more conferences as a research student, I found that I was taking all these really boring notes, line after line after line of text-based notes, and I would never go back and look at them because I didn't want to look at them. They were boring, and they were my own notes, but I didn't care to revise them, and so I felt like I was going away from these conferences not having absorbed a lot of information. And so I was trying to find a way to do that better. And when I was a teenager, when I was in high school, I used mind maps a lot to help me with my writing. And so I thought I'd adapt it for the purposes of attending seminars, workshops, and conferences. And then I think one of my friends saw me doing one of these sketch notes, and they said, "Oh, that's pretty cool. You should share that with some people." And I had a blog where I still have this blog where I write from time to time, and I thought, well, why not? I'll just publish it and see what happens. And like I said, I continue to be surprised that will find it engaging and find it useful for their own learning. Because for me, the learning comes from the actual process of doing the notes. I actually find I don't really look at my own sketch notes either, but somehow I absorb more information just from the act of putting my virtual pen to paper and synthesizing that information rather than taking notes on my laptop or writing barely legible text on a piece of paper.
Yeah.
That's really where it starts from, and I found it to be really effective for my own learning and surprisingly really engaging for other people too.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you mentioned it to me before we started recording, but where do you take these notes, and what kind of implements do you use to take them?
Yep, it's a pretty simple setup. So I use an iPad and a stylus in terms of hardware, and software I use an app called GoodNotes, and that's one word for anyone who wants to look that up. So they've got a free version that you can try out, and they've got a paid version as well, which has some more features. But the free version is pretty good, and I use that for a long time. And that's essentially my process. I'll sit down at a conference or a conference presentation or workshop. I try to arrive a little bit earlier and write down the title of the presentation, do a little sketch of the speaker if possible, write down their name just to make it a little bit interesting for me, and just find get myself into the right mindset, because it is a very demanding exercise. It requires you to listen very carefully and also synthesize information while you're receiving new information throughout the course of a presentation. So I find I need a few minutes to focus myself and prepare myself for the next 15, 20, 30 minutes. And then I sketch live. My process varies. Sometimes I will sketch live and complete the sketch pretty well, in the first 10 or 15 minutes after a presentation is finished. Sometimes my perfectionism gets the better of me and I spend more time afterwards. So it can be double the presentation time, where it might be an hour presentation and an hour of editing and cleaning up before I actually publish it to the world. But these days I try to make it as efficient as possible.
Interesting. So, excuse me. So I'm going to bring the the second to last point towards the back. So just another thing, again, back on the stalking. I'm not some complete weirdo, but the wearable kind of conversation, which I'd like your knowledge and experience on. It was something that I discussed, not necessarily wearables, but technology was something I discussed with a guy over here who came on the podcast a few episodes ago. And people getting roped into buying a piece of technology and taking their data as gospel, and not going through a process of, okay, is this data that it's given me, is this actually correct? I'm making decisions off this. So what process, firstly, would you go through this kind of process that he went through in actually making sure that it's doing what it says it's doing? And if so, what does that process look like?
Yeah, look, I think that there are a whole range of measurement properties that we need to consider, and I think we are continuing to improve our processes as a community, as a sports science community, around understanding the measurement properties of the different measures that we have, particularly the sensor technologies that continue to advance faster than our ability to study them. But I think there are some really good examples from how this is done in, I guess, I hesitate to say it a little bit, but I guess higher stakes environments like the medical setting, where the accuracy of a measurement tool may be the difference between making a decision that, negatively or positively impacts someone's health and their prognosis. So in those environments, measurement properties are at the forefront of people's minds. How accurate is this blood pressure monitor? How accurate is the oxygen saturation measurement? All those sorts of things. Those are questions we don't ask, I think, as readily in sport because it's not life or death usually for most of us. But the concepts stay the same. So, the different aspects of validity, not just comparing to other measures that do the similar things, but comparing to whatever the true gold standard is. I guess one of the difficulties with that is that there are some things in sport which we don't have a gold standard for. And, we were talking about training load before, and we don't have, one conventional known gold standard of measuring training load. So there's no way for us to really have established criterion validity because there is no gold standard to compare to. But we can look at, is it valid compared to other things that we know measure training load, some aspect of it. So validity is one massive part. Reliability always comes into it, particularly from the perspective of sensor technologies, where you'll have the manufacturing of many tens of thousands of devices potentially, and there could be variations between devices. So knowing whether there are differences between devices or even differences between when different operators are using a device is important and can be accounted for, but sometimes we don't go through that process because it seems tedious. If we go through that process, we can actually identify known systematic error and eliminate that from our calculations or I suppose account for that error so that we can improve the accuracy of the final numbers that we're using to make decisions. I guess, this also comes down to questions of feasibility and burden, and those are still really important questions that I think sometimes get lost in the argument about validity and reliability. I think burden is something that we always need to consider, even though wearing a watch or wearing some sort of biometric sensor stitched into clothing seems to be less burden than other techniques, invasive techniques as an example. I think we still need to think about, it can be a bit of a pain to have to put a monitor on your wrist every night to monitor your sleep and to remember to do that every single night. And, if you're traveling, you might forget it and leave it at home. And these are all very practical considerations that we need to keep at the forefront of our minds and try to perhaps smooth that path, or at least keep it in the front of our minds when we're organising to implement some sort of wearable solution into sport.
Mm-hmm. So just taking GPS for an example, with more kind of affordable units coming on the market, and people taking them up more probably even though they're maybe focused on a kind of consumer unit, people are taking them on as team units for football clubs, whether it be academies or first teams. So with that said, what would be the process in making sure that obviously people are making decisions, like we've said, off these pieces of technology? With GPS, what would be the process of making sure that data that it's giving me or you is actually usable and available to make decisions from? What would be that process to make sure that's happening?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, there are some great examples of GPS validation that really could be mimicked in a lot of ways if people wanted to internally validate for themselves, or even as research projects, some of these consumer units for movement monitoring. Aaron Coots did a lot of great work around this sort of in the late 2000s, so around 2010, give or take a few years. And the process that Aaron and his colleagues followed, I think, is a really sound one that can be adapted as needed, which is to develop movement circuits that mimic the demands of whatever sport you're wanting to monitor, and then simply having people wear multiple devices at the same time while doing the same circuit, and looking at the accuracy of those two devices, the comparative accuracy and reliability. And I think also an important thing is to for people to understand that these sensors and wearable devices do have a range of error. So yeah, a lot of consumer devices will present a single number to represent what you've done in that session. You might get a reading that says, yep, you've run 5Ks today. But the truth of it is that every sensor has some amount of error, even if it's a minute amount. And I think we need to be understanding of the fact that even the best devices do have a plus or minus. It's 5Ks plus or minus a certain amount. And that might be 5 meters, or it could be 50 centimeters or 5 centimeters, but there is still error. And I think when we can understand that, then we will come to a more sensible and sensitive use of sensor technologies and the data that they provide us. And that, I think, then allows us to make better decisions with confidence, or perhaps without confidence. Because if we're getting a device that says, hey, you've run 5Ks today, plus or minus 2Ks, then we know that kind of device is not giving us very useful information. But if we come to the understanding that, hey, it's 5Ks plus or minus 5 centimeters, then that's perhaps an amount of error that we can live with. Mm-hmm. So I think that in terms of establishing whether consumer devices are appropriate for monitoring athletic performance, it does come down to understanding the measurement properties of those devices, but also knowing how much error are you willing to live with, and what you might be able to do to minimize that error as well. Is it a technical thing? Is it something that is inherent to the sensor? Can you improve the way that you, start all the devices at the same time, perhaps? Or can you change training venues to have a greater access to satellites compared to covered areas? And all these small things add up to improve the performance of even consumer level devices, which are becoming not just increasingly available and affordable, but they are increasingly accurate. It's just that you do need to go through the process of establishing that, because the pace of change is so fast that the research evidence to support these devices and their accuracy and reliability does tend to lag behind the actual advancements in hardware and software.
Mm-hmm. Cool, very interesting. Well, I don't want to take too much of your time up, but just want to give us just let us know where people can keep up to date with what you've going on, and most importantly, the sketches. Where can people get to see the sketches?
Sure.
So do a bit of stalking of their own.
Yeah, sure. The easiest place is really my website, which is www.jacquietran.com. So that's JACQUIETRAN.com. So that's a central point for all the places I exist on in the internet sense, all the different platforms and different networks that I have a presence on. So that's probably the best place, but you can also look at my blog. That's phdblog.jacquietran.com, and that's where you can find my sketch notes. There's a link up the top, so you can easily navigate to that. Or you can also tweet me. So my handle is Jacquie Tran as well, same spelling as my website. And feel free to tweet me anytime, and always happy to chat and engage with people. But I always do find it funny that as a sports scientist, I get asked so much about my sketch notes. So who knew that I could find my way into an illustration career through sports science?
Hey, it's worked for other people. Maybe not illustrations, but infographics and things like that.
Yeah, that's right. No, it's a lot of fun, and it's a part of my job that I never envisaged that would be part of my job, but I really enjoy it. It adds a lot of variety, and I'm always happy for people to ask questions, or if they want to send sketch notes that they've done, then that's even better. I love seeing people engage in it as well.
Cool. Well, thanks again for your time, and really appreciate you coming on. So we'll keep in touch, and we'll speak soon. Fantastic. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Jacquie. See you later.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to episode 74 of the Pacey Performance Podcast. I hope you enjoyed the chat with Jacquie. So, as I mentioned in the intro, and we mentioned a couple of times throughout the episode, if you want to find out anything more about Jacquie, her research, just her interest, or just her in person, get over to jacquietran.com. So that's JACQUINTRAN.com. As I mentioned, actually, as I put out on Twitter a couple of days ago, the last 30 days have been really, really good for the podcast. Obviously, nothing to do with me, and solely to do with the great guests that have been on. So we've had just under 20,000 downloads in the last 30 days, which is superb. So thank you very much for all the support. Keep the ratings and reviews coming on iTunes. They're all really appreciated. Some great guests coming up over the next couple of weeks and months. And I will speak to you in episode 75.